So the Grand Chess Tour is back. 5 events, as you can see on screen here, and we're starting with the Superbet Chess Classic played in Bucharest, Romania. Now there's a ton of superstars in action, including the world champion Ding Liren and the challenger Jan Nepomniachtchi, a whole host of other super GMs as well, and I'll show the full list of players at the end along with the round 1 standings. Now the other interesting thing about this Grand Chess Tour is that it finishes with the Sinquefield Cup, this year being played in November, rolling into December. Of course, last year when it was played in September, we saw the huge cheating scandal erupt between Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann, still rumbling on with a lawsuit. And the other interesting thing about the Sinquefield Cup is that that was the last time that Alireza Firouzja played chess over the board. So it's been 8 months since he was at the races. What would happen today? Well, the 19-year-old was playing 29-year-old Wesley So from America. Let's see what happened in this brilliant game. So Alireza kicks off with e4. We get e5, and these opening moves take us down the Italian game now with the bishop on c4. Wesley copies the bishop placement, we get d3, d6, and after c3 we now see something unusual, so bishop b6 on the board. More often than not, you see knight f6, far and away the main move. Now Wesley said that this was some work of Fabiano Caruana a couple of years ago, so very subtle stuff. Alireza just carries on with castles. Now we get pawn to h6. So still delaying the development of this knight, and of course it cuts out any bishop g5 pins. Okay, I guess Wesley didn't want to play that kind of game. So we see knight beats d2 from Alireza, the knight develops to f6, this bishop nudges back, all very standard, along with this pawn a5 push. Okay, you could have castled first, but this is a very standard kind of space gaining move. And now Alireza doesn't go a4, which isn't a bad move. You know, it's almost the stock response that usually white takes some space instead, as well, sorry. But instead, we see rook e1, also a decent move, castles, h3, all standard stuff, and now bishop e6 from Wesley. Now you don't have to take and double the pawns. You can go a4, knight c4 is another suggestion of the engine, but Alireza takes, the pawn recaptures, and although black's now doubled these pawns, well, this one does add some strength to the centre, opens up the f-file. Now what's Alireza's idea? Well, he can now plant a knight on c4 without blocking this bishop. He hits this one here, it retreats. You don't want to ruin that pawn structure, you want to keep that strong piece. And from c4, this knight now pressures the pawn, along with this one, and so black's not going d5 anytime soon. Bishop e3 now played. Good move, trading off that powerful dark squared bishop, and now the rook recaptures, very logical. This is a strong knight, you don't want to misplace it and start traffic jamming all the white pieces. But now Wesley, he takes the moment to go pawn a4 because Alireza never did it sooner. And it's interesting really, is this going to be a liability or an asset? Well, we'll look at that later in the game. So d4 from Alireza, the standard move, striking at the centre. And now Wesley captures this pawn, and this can be risky. When you give white this big centre, the connected 2 pawns, well, you better have something in mind, because otherwise they're going to squeeze all your space. But this is Wesley's idea. He pushes with d5, and because you hit the knight as well as the pawn, well, this sequence is basically forced, and Wesley has pretty much equalised the position. Now, the most logical move in the world is to jump the knight in here, right? But Alireza didn't do it. Again, I kind of spoke about this the other day. It's so typical of his style to try and keep pieces on, keep complexity. And the problem here is that it's pretty symmetrical. Okay, not quite symmetrical. The pawn structure, you've got one extra here, one extra here. But it's not going to be so easy for either side to prove anything. And you've helped white get rid of that knight. They can go c6 soon. So what does Alireza do? Well, he drops this knight back, and he's saying, okay, this one's maybe more passive here, but I think this one's more of a problem for you. So queen d6 now played, and there's an idea of queen b4 to pressure b2 and d4 at the same time. So a3 prevents that move. We now see queen f4 pressuring the d pawn, and so Alireza drops this knight back, opens up the queen to defend, and he prepares knight c3. And if he could get one more tempo to get that move, he'd be doing quite well, because he'd be pressuring here, everything like that. But knight e4 from Wesley, it comes just in time, because now when knight c3 lands on the board, you can capture it, the rook recaptures, and Wesley's doing fine. He's solid. But there is pressure on that c7 pawn. So we see queen d6, rook ac1, and rook f7, laterally defending, and this knight's just slightly clumsy for black. But it does put pressure on the centre, we should note that. And this is where we now see some shuffling. So Alireza goes rook 1 c2, queen f4, rook f4, pressuring this centre some more. And after rook e3, taking the open file, well, now queen f6 just forces that rook back, because you have to take care of the d pawn. And now Wesley, he takes the open e file. Rook c5 pressures the d pawn, queen d6 covers, the rook drops back, rook fe4 played, and after g3 from Alireza, we see an invasion but a challenge. So that rook exchanged, the queen recaptures, and now here Wesley, he plays quickly, but it's not the best move. So he should go queen to e6 here, best move. He goes queen g6. Now why is this slightly inaccurate? Well, Alireza could have played here, which he missed, queen d1. And the reason this is a strong move is that you now pressure this pawn, which is hard to defend. By the way, if the queen had been on e6, well, the reason that was better, if white goes queen d1, you could have gone queen e2. And you offer the exchange. If the capture here, then the queen from e2 pressures b2. But okay, with the queen on g6, well, now if you get something like queen f5, it's easier to start picking up this pawn. Not straight away, or black can actually go queen b1 check, pick up here. But after king g2, well, now you have to go something passive like rook a8. And I won't keep going down the line, but white can get good pressure basically. Start to build the position. Queen e2, rook c5, these kind of ideas, knight h4 as well. But Alireza misses it. He doesn't go queen d1. He goes king g2, now queen b1 on the board, and rook c1 kicks the queen out. It drops back to f5, rook c3, queen b1, and this is where Alireza now, we see pure destruction, but it's the self-destruction of Alireza, because he doesn't take the draw against Wesley So, doesn't take the repetition, he wants more. This is what we love about him. So he goes pawn h4. Now we get rook e7, rook c1, the queen drops back, but this time Alireza goes queen d1 at the wrong moment. Now if he keeps the queen on d2, then this next move isn't so dangerous, because bang, Wesley goes g5, counter-attacking, letting Alireza have this pawn. And the reason you couldn't do this if the queen was on d2, well then we just take, recaptures, and you take with either queen or bishop. But with the queen on d1, this is dangerous, because after Alireza captures, the big problem here is that g4 is coming. You can't prevent it. It's going to kick this knight, which then weakens this pawn and also this diagonal against the king. And if you were to capture this one, well, this is awful. You can even start with rook f7, pressure this one, if rook c3 to cover, then g4, and this is dropping behind. So what did Alireza do? Well, queen d2 now. He amends his mistake, but g4 comes on the board. So Alireza, he hops his knight to the edge of the board, hits the queen, and he wants to kind of invade somewhere here, bring the knight in, get some counterplay, but after check from Wesley, it's actually Wesley who starts attacking the white king. Now, Alireza goes wrong again. He should go king g1, stay with the f-pawn, but he goes king h2, allowing the queen to take here, but more importantly, then attack this pawn which isn't defended. Now, you don't want to swap the queens. That's much better for black. You have to try and go for these counter checks. We see the check, rook g7 blocking, queen f5, rook f7, now double attacking this pawn after the check, and after king f8, this is the big problem with not having the king on g1. Because if the king was on g1, you could then go check. After the king sidesteps, you can check from e1, the king moves away, and you can blockade with this knight. And because the king would be here, the pawn would be covered, and actually white's doing quite well here with threats against that pawn. this knight's better than this knight, this rook's better than this rook, this king's more drafty than this one, so the king just had to be on g1. But what Alireza played now meant that this pawn couldn't be defended in time, so he went for king h1, giving the pawn if Wesley wanted it. But Wesley didn't take the pawn, because then you actually drop this one on g4, you know, the queen's left the defense, and it gets a bit murky basically. There are other lines too, you know, similar to this. If the rook takes, well, now we come to the e-file, there are threats around the king, these kind of things going on. So Wesley plays a great move of queen e4 check. The king sidesteps and then king e8, and he's just keeping control on the position, using this passed d pawn. So queen d2 nudges back. We see rook e7 coming behind the queen. Rook d1 pressures the pawn, and d4 advances into the position. Queen g5 played, looking at ideas perhaps of queen g6 check, maybe forcing the queens off, but knight e5 comes, covering that square, and look at how that piece is now activating into the game. There's no white pawn covering this square. And now queen d2 from Alireza was a sneaky little move. So it encourages this pawn on, and then he goes queen f4. He didn't do it a move earlier, so that after Wesley takes, which we see in the game, by the way, the computer calls it a miss because it wanted queen e2 as the top move, but then you have to calculate queen takes on a4 check, very computery chess. Wesley just sees that he can go for this and get a good endgame. Now the reason Alireza did it in this order is because once the pawn has kicked on, well, now when the knight gets kicked, it can't come back to c6, defend the pawn on d4. So instead it comes to c4, Alireza gets to pick up here, but still Wesley's doing well after taking here, and we'll see why. Because these three pawns on one on the queen side are stronger than these two on one on the king side, especially when they're doubled. So rook c3, the rook was attacked. And now after rook d7, king g2, called a miss by the computer by the way, because it wanted knight g6 to start with, but okay. We now see knight d3, and look at that octopus for Wesley. You know, I talked about a similar thing for Alireza against Esipenko, played in the recent title Tuesday, which I'll link at the end, and this just dominates the white position, because now after king g3, these queenside pawns get rolling, supported by the knight. So king takes on g4, pawn b5, knight f5 comes into the game. Wesley decides to activate the king. We now see king g5, rook d5 pins, and after rook c2, we see a slightly imprecise move from Wesley of knight e1. You know, Alireza could have gone rook e2 now, still leaves black with advantage, but Alireza nudges back. I mean, look at his clock, 30 seconds. Wesley's got 2 minutes. And after knight d3 back, the position is repeated, rook c2 again from Alireza, but now Wesley, he pushes on with these pawns. So we see captures, pawn recaptures, rook c7 check, the king goes, king f6 marches in, there's a threat to go king e6, hit the rook, and threaten mates. So king d8 hits Alireza's rook, we see rook a7 coming behind the pawn, but now pawn b3. You cannot take, or b2 comes, and you just cannot stop this pawn from going through. There's no rook a1, there's no rook b4. So instead, we see knight e3 hits that rook. Check was played, and because the knight and king form the barrier, the king can't get to the rook, so it nudges back to f5, and now pawn b2. The pawn's about to go through, so the rook comes behind. Rook d4 played, not only hitting the f4 pawn, but also threatening rook b4, supported by the knight, intercepting this one, and then making a queen. So knight c2 from Alireza hits the rook, covers the b4 square, but now we see pawn drops with check, the king goes, a second pawn drops, the knight has to move, and rook f1 finished the game. Here Alireza resigned. Why? Because you can't stop the pawn from going through or losing material. You know, if you go rook b6 to stay behind the pawn, well then rook a1 can come, you kick away this knight which is defending the pawn, and the pawn goes through. This is just one sample line. So these are the final standings at the end of round 1. All games were drawn apart from this one, and so after one round, Wesley's sitting on top of the pack. To see another epic Alireza game, then check out the video on screen. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.